Okay, we are continuing in our series on the book of Ecclesiastes, and there's some very interesting observations we need to make, and we are only going to cover the first 11 verses of Ecclesiastes chapter 2. And this is a good visual to look at and to understand very simplistically. There's only two ways to live, and we've already identified how Solomon is living his life. It's under the sun. And he has already expressed his philosophical frustration of chasing after wind and vanity and emptiness. And hopefully we remember what that word means of deception and fraud and deceit and misrepresentation. And when we are in pursuit of purpose and meaning of life apart from God, it will yield only disappointment and frustration. And the cycle begins again, and it gets more entrenched, and great despair and pain and suffering takes place. So let's do some basic observation of the text. Some basic observations of the text. This is what you should do when you read through any scriptures. Now, whether this is for your own devotional time or whether this is preparation for a study that you might be teaching, read through the passage several times and ask the Spirit of God to show you, and you will be surprised how many things that you can observe if you slow down and the significance of those things. Now, first of all, in verses 12 to 18 of chapter 1, the personal pronoun I, it's used only 6 times. It's used only 6 times. However, in chapter 2, in 11 verses, the personal pronoun I is used 21 times. That's over 3 times as much. And one of the things that we can conclude from that, after this observation here, the phrase "for myself" is used 5 times in about as many verses. So notice the amplification of Solomon's closing words from chapter 1, verse 18, where he says, "Because in much wisdom there is much grief, and increasing knowledge results in increasing pain." Solomon is going to now jump into the deep end of the pool, and we see the emphasis of I and his pursuits and everything that he sets his hand to and everything that he sets his mind to. He's used that phrase at least 2 times. Is for himself, for his own pleasure, for his own gratification. He is seeking meaning and purpose and significance in life apart from God. Now, the general outline is verses 1 through 3, the deceitfulness of pleasure. This is also called hedonism. Notice in verse 1, I said to myself, okay, so instead of communing with God, he's communing with himself. And he says, come now, I will test you with pleasure. The word test does not mean in the Hebrew an examination of pass or failure. It means to try. He says, so I'm going to try pleasure. I'm going to see what it holds. I'm going to see if I can have some meaning and purpose by experimenting with pleasure, by trying pleasure, any type of pleasure that my five senses tells me, go ahead and try it. See what happens. See if you enjoy it. See if it brings meaning and significance to your life. So enjoy yourself. And behold, it too was futility. It also yielded emptiness. I was deceived by my senses. I was tricked by my feelings. And that's why Jeremiah reminds us, do not trust in your feelings. Do not trust your heart. It is deceitful and wicked. Then in verse 2, he said, I said of laughter, it is madness, and of pleasure, what does it accomplish? So with all of the frivolity of life, it still was deceitful. It promises rest and peace and enjoyment and satisfaction. But at the end of the night, at the end of the period of time that I set my mind to see what it really held and contained for me, I didn't accomplish anything. In fact, my situation is probably worse than when I set my hand to try this. It can be likened unto somebody who is involved with an addiction. And they think that trying this addiction by the encouragement of others or whatever it might be, that it's going to give them fulfillment. It's going to help release the pressure and the tension. It's going to alleviate the problems that they are facing. But in reality, in the morning when they wake up, the problem is still there. Reality has not changed. The situation remains just as harmful, and if pursued continually, it deepens and gets worse. He says in verse 3, I explored with my mind how to stimulate my body with wine, while my mind was guiding me wisely. Now, you keep in mind here, his mind, this is his perspective, is not the mind of God. So in his thinking, in his rationalization, my mind was guiding me wisely and how to take hold of folly until I could see what good there is for the sons of men to do under heaven the few years of their life. What can I accomplish in the short time that I have? I tried my level best to penetrate the absurdity of life with stimulating my body. I wanted to entertain whatever the cravings of my flesh desired. And he will go into what he got involved with in verses 4 and following. But there was nothing that he denied himself of. Whatever his eye was set upon, and he thought it would bring him pleasure, he pursued it. Whatever he thought that his hand could accomplish, that at the end he could say, see, like Nebuchadnezzar, what I have built, it was emptiness. And so he is going to try, we'll look at that in a minute, but there's no satisfaction. Again, keep in mind, this is all apart from God. That's why the Apostle Paul in Philippians said this in chapter 4. I have learned to be content in whatever state I find myself, whether I have a lot or whether I don't have a lot. The psalmist prayed that God would not give him too much where he would ignore God, or give him too little where he would be critical of God. Solomon was given the gift of God's wisdom. He had seen the results of using God's wisdom that we looked at earlier in previous lessons. But instead of being content for the outcome of that, which meant God was getting glory, he took the gift of God and began to experiment in other areas, looking for more purpose, more meaning, more significance. Apart from God, there is no more of anything. Our completeness, Colossians chapter 1, is in Christ. Now, can you define the word hedonism? Can you define that word hedonism? It's the doctrine that pleasure or happiness is the sole or chief good in life. It's the doctrine, it's the belief, it's the philosophy which somebody embraces, that pleasure or happiness is the sole or chief good in life. That's the only thing to pursue. If it's not going to make me happy, I will not pursue that. I will not be involved with it. Even if it means that I transgress some type of ordinance or law, because I don't view that ordinance or law as beneficial to me. Hedonism is not concerned about other people, and it certainly is not concerned about God. This is a driving force. Today, you might have an example of hedonism, and it would come underneath this term, materialism, the pursuit of things, with the belief that whatever I pursue will give me pleasure, will give me happiness. And in reality, that does not achieve the final end for the purpose, because there's always something bigger and better. There's always something bigger and better to pursue. It lacks contentment. Now, in verses 4 to 10, we see the delusion of projects. Notice in verse 4, I enlarged my works. So I'm not content with what I've been able to accomplish. I'm going to enlarge them. I'm going to expand. And again, if you read in 1 Kings, you will see all that he did. I built houses for myself. How many houses can you live in? I suppose you could have a house for every day of the week. Amelia Marco, the Filipino president way back when she was finally ousted, they raided the palace, and there were hundreds and hundreds of pairs of shoes in her closet. How many pairs of shoes can you wear? And Solomon says, okay, I'm going to build more houses. I planted vineyards, here's the first time, for myself. I know in Kings it says that gold was as plentiful as silver, and silver had lost its value. But were there not any poor people in and around Jerusalem that looked up to him? When he planted the vineyards, would it not be for a community project, a community outreach, to go ahead and minister to citizens in his kingdom? But no, it's for myself. Verse 6, I made gardens and parks for myself. Again, the pleasure. So I'm going to have these beautiful parks and these beautiful gardens just for myself, that I could walk through them anytime that I wanted to. Maybe one of the reasons he planted so many gardens and parks was to get away from his 300 wives and 700 concubines. I don't know. And I wonder if any of those parks and gardens were shrines to the wives and the concubines' idols that he had brought into Jerusalem. I planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. Remember, every 3 years, the ships would return with great treasures from foreign countries that were not known to the Mideastern area, and in particular, Jerusalem. And I believe he got many of his trees from there. And then I made ponds of water for myself from which to irrigate a forest of growing trees. So instead of a viaduct bringing in fresh, cool water to the inhabitants, it's only for his gardens, only for his trees. I bought male and female slaves, which he was not to accumulate, and I had homeborn slaves. Well, after so many wives and concubines, you're bound to, hit the ding ding bell and say, oh, I'm pregnant, and you have built-in servants. Also, I possessed flocks and herds larger than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. This man's wealth is beyond human understanding and calculation. Also, I collected for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I provided for myself male and female singers and the pleasures of men, many concubines. So, in other words, he had his own troupe of musicians and entertainers. And so, at his evening meal that he hosted for many different people in the cabinet, and you can read about how much food a day from First Kings that had to be supplied by the citizens to him for his pleasure. He had a troupe of men and women who would sing and dance and play instruments just for him. Then I became great and increased more than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. My wisdom also stood by me. But for the grace of God, he could have been ousted. But God stood by him, hoping that he might see through his futile efforts that behind everything was the one who gave him the gift. Verse 10, all that my eyes desired, I did. I did not refuse them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart was pleased because of all my labors, and this was my reward for all my labors. This was my reward. Nothing about God, nothing about God's blessing, nothing about God's reward because he were pursuing God. This was my reward because of the work of my hands. The whole focus is hedonistic. The whole focus is upon himself, like Nebuchadnezzar, who rose up early in the morning and said, "Behold, look what I have created." Now, Solomon did not get struck down as a wild beast for 7 years. Nebuchadnezzar was, until he finally came to his senses. But the book of Ecclesiastes portrays a painful experience of Solomon going through all of these things until finally, near the end, he comes to his senses and proclaims in 2 short verses what he should have done in the introduction to this book. And then there's a reality check in verse 11. Thus I considered all my activities which my hands had done, and the labor which I had exerted. So he stops and begins to take inventory. Does he go from house to house? Does he walk through all the gardens and around the ponds and takes a toll, a number of all the trees that he's planted? He does a reality check. I considered, I looked at, I examined all my activities which my hands had done and the labor which I had exerted. And he must have been pretty proud initially, but look at the rest of the verse. And behold, all was emptiness, vanity. I've been deceived. I've deluded myself and striving after wind. And there was no profit under the sun. So no matter what I could point to, it didn't bring me what I hoped it would bring me. It was chasing after wind, empty.